All right, the Russian Revolution. See if you can name the three people in this opening picture. So think about it. Well, the first one is Stalin, the second one is Lenin, and the third one is Trotsky. All right, so this is 16.4. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution. So in this section, we will look at the causes of the February Revolution, or as we call it in the West, the March Revolution. Russia was still on an older calendar at this point, so they call it the February Revolution. In the West, we tend to call it the March Revolution. We'll look at the goals of Lenin and his Bolsheviks in the October Revolution, the Second Revolution. So we're going to talk about two revolutions in Russia. And then after the Second Revolution, we'll look at the outcome of what becomes a civil war, basically the whites versus the reds, who's on each side and who's supporting each side. And then once the communists are successful, we'll look at how Lenin built a communist state in the Soviet Union, and then we will just get to the point where Stalin takes over. All right, get everyone on the same page here. So during the World War I years, during the war years, Russia faced significant problems back at home. Remember, we've always talked about Russia being somewhat behind the Western countries. Well, they were certainly struggling in World War I. Initially, the goals of the revolution were to end the war. So the first revolution solved the problems that an earlier revolution from 1905 had not resolved. The March Revolution brought the overthrow of the Tsar, so they get rid of the autocratic ruler. And then the November Revolution, the second one, brings an end to this in-between or provisional government, puts into power Lenin and ultimately his successor, Joseph Stalin, which creates communist Russia. So with Tsar Nicholas, he had been the Tsar for some time as we move into the 20th century, and there had been a revolution, an attempt to overthrow the Tsar in 1905. There were promises made, some talk of reform, but unfortunately for the population of Russia's sake, Tsar Nicholas did very little to solve Russia's problems. We still had the elites, the rulers living in a very luxurious lifestyle, while most of the population lived in poverty. Corruption was rampant throughout the government of the Tsar, and the legislature in Russia, called the Duma, had no real power. They existed, but it was an autocratic regime controlled by Tsar Nicholas. So here is the royal family. 1913 marked the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty, so that's where Tsar Nicholas is a part of. And across Russia, the Russians honored the Tsar and his family, and we have this quote from the Tsarina Alexandra, who felt confident that the people still loved Nicholas too much to ever truly overthrow him. Her quote is, "They're constantly frightening the emperor with threats of revolution," she told a friend, "and here you see yourself. We need to merely show ourselves, and at once their hearts are ours." So there was a sense in the royal family that they were somewhat insulated, that they were loved by their population to the point where they would not be overthrown, but we'll see what happens. So initially, as it did for most of the participants in World War I, it united Russians. They had a common goal: support the Slavic people and keep in check, if you will, the powers, the other European powers, Germany and Austria. But very early on from the get-go, the war put a significant strain on the country's resources, and part of that's due to mismanagement, part of that is due to the fact that they just didn't have as developed resources as the other powers did. Industrially, they were certainly behind the West, so they weren't nearly as industrialized. They couldn't produce enough military supplies to support the troops. They didn't have the infrastructure to deliver the food, the supplies to the battlefield, to the front. for their soldiers to use. So as a result, many soldiers were sent to the front with no guns, or if they had guns, they would have very little ammunition. And you can imagine being on the front lines and trying to fight against guns and tanks and bigger guns and only having a few bullets or having a sword and not having a gun. So they were at a disadvantage from the get-go. As a result, casualties are extremely high for the Russians, if you remember from the chart we looked at in the last section, and millions of soldiers, Russian soldiers, die. You add all these factors together and there's very little confidence in the government. Things were going bad militarily, so Tsar Nicholas thought he could take it upon himself to lead the troops, but he proved to be a very ineffective military leader, so him going to the front didn't have a positive impact. While he was at the front, the Tsarina Alexandra, was in charge, and she wasn't really in tune with the needs of the people. She couldn't deal with and manage the food shortages and the fuel shortages. So the people were suffering, and there was no clear response from the government. And as she ruled things in the absence of Tsar Nicholas, who was at the front, she relied on Gregory Rasputin, who was a self-proclaimed holy man, sometimes called the Mad Monk. She believed that he had some magical powers. And her reliance upon the advice of this seemingly mad individual eroded the public trust in the government, and there was frustration on the part of the population. March of 1917, the workers go on strike, and they march, mostly women march, through the streets looking for food, so chanting for bread, bread, looking to feed their families. And you can see, even if you look in the picture, most of the marchers outside of those carrying the banners are women. So you've got workers on strike, you've got people marching in the streets for bread and for food. Well, Tsar Nicholas orders that the military, soldiers, fire on these crowds to break up these protests. Well, many of the soldiers refused to do that. As a result, they were charged with mutiny. So we've got disaster on the battlefield, we've got disaster and protests back home. It finally gets to the point where it's untenable, and Tsar Nicholas abdicates. So he steps aside, and this is called the March Revolution. So this is the first revolution, March of 1917. The legislature, the Duma, sets up a temporary government, and these are mostly members of the middle class. So it's a temporary government, they're governing things, but they're beginning to write a constitution that would create not a monarchy, but a Russian republic. There are revolutionaries in Russia that don't necessarily want a republic. They've got other ideas. So once they see an opportunity, they begin to scheme behind the scenes to try to establish and institute another kind of government. And we'll see who those revolutionary groups are here in just a moment. So the two revolutionary groups, the radical revolutionary groups in Russia, are the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. All right, now the Mensheviks are a little more conservative, so they favor changing things gradually, so gradual reform. So they would support higher wages for the workers, increased suffrage or voting in the population, some social welfare programs to provide for those that can't take care of themselves. And then you've also got the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks believe in radical change. So they want to change things yesterday. So they don't want to wait and work within the process necessarily. They want a revolution to instantaneously put in their type of government. So the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks are the two primary revolutionary groups in Russia. So we have the provisional government writing this constitution. We've got these two groups of revolutionary socialists that are plotting their own direction, that maybe want to do things a little bit differently than the Duma might want to do as a republic. In St. Petersburg, which is named Petrograd at this time in World War I, you have these groups. They're called Soviets or councils of workers. established, and they begin to talk amongst themselves and talk about ideas for a government. Initially, at least, these groups, these Soviets or councils, worked within the government. So they were working with the provisional government. But very soon, the Bolsheviks, remember they're the radical group that they want to have change very quickly, they get impatient, and the Bolsheviks take charge of these Soviets. The leader of the Bolsheviks is a determined revolutionary, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. So Lenin is the leader of the Bolsheviks, and he is a Marxist. So Karl Marx, so think about what you remember about the ideas of Karl Marx that he wrote in his Communist Manifesto. So Lenin calls for the workers to unite, the proletariat to unite and overthrow capitalism. Again, that's very consistent with Karl Marx. He talked about unity among the workers and the farmers, so the workers in the factories and the farmers in the fields. And he promised three things. He tried to keep it simple so that his message could be understood. He talked about promising peace, basically to get Russia out of World War I. He talked about land, and that means getting land to the peasants. And he talked about bread, because there was a shortage of food throughout the Russian population. In November, same year, 1917, so in November 1917, Lenin and his Bolsheviks take power from the provisional government. So this is the second revolution. So we have the March Revolution and the November Revolution. The November Revolution is when the Bolsheviks, who rename themselves the Communists, step in and they take charge. And very quickly, Lenin ends private ownership of land. Again, that's something that Karl Marx would have stood for. He gives that land to the peasants, so he's going to endear himself to the peasant population right away. He gives control of the factories and the mines to the workers. Again, that's very communist in philosophy. And he also withdraws as an ally in World War I. So remember, Russia was a member of the Allied side, but Russia is going to get themselves out of the war because it wasn't going well for them. They were paying a great price. And they make their own peace with Germany and pull out of the war. So in making that separate peace with Germany, with the Central Powers, it's the 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So a treaty with the Central Powers. When Russia pulls out of the war, you can see that Russia is forced to give up some territory. So that territory there in the blue goes to Germany. The territory in the red or maroon goes to Austria-Hungary, and the area in the green goes to the Ottoman Empire. So in making their peace, in getting out of the war, while the rest of the Allies are still fighting, Russia does give up some significant territory, but they're getting out of the war. In the last section, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles, which comes the next year in 1919. And this is, again, what the map looks like after that. So you've got Russia there on the right, and some of that land that Russia had given up in the 1918 treaty is going to become those independent countries. So just because the Bolsheviks, the communists, take charge, that doesn't mean that things are settled. So subsequently, we have a civil war that breaks out between the communists, who become known as the Reds, and their opponents, who become known as the Whites. All right, so the Reds are going to be the communists, the Whites are going to be supporters of the Tsar. We're also going to have the United States, Great Britain, and France, to some extent, support the ideas of the Whites, and they'll send some resources. The U.S. actually sent some troops to fight in the Civil War on the side of the Whites. So the Reds versus the Whites. One of the Bolshevik leaders, Trotsky, creates a Red Army to support their cause, using officers who no longer would support the Tsar, led by commissars. The army, again, was very well led, very effective, well positioned in the center of Russia against the Whites. And as you well know from other times you might have heard this story, 1918, the former Tsar, the Tsarina, and their family were assassinated. And in 1920, the Red Army wins the Civil War and they take total control of Russia. So in the early years of the revolution, so after the November Revolution, Lenin adopts an economic policy of what he calls war communism. So basically it's a command economy. The government, the party, is going to control the banks, the mines, the factories, and the railroads. So they're going to decide what gets produced. Unfortunately for Lenin, this policy of the government or the party controlling everything cuts production, and it's very inefficient. And the economy is near collapse, so it's not working at this point. So Lenin decides pragmatically to change his course, and he establishes something called the New Economic Policy, which is a compromise with capitalism. So he's going to allow the farmers to save some of their production and sell it on the marketplace privately. He's going to allow some private business to be established that's not run and controlled by the government. So some elements of capitalism to get the economy going. Some other similarities and differences between war communism initially and new economic policy. State-controlled banks, the mines, factories, and the railroads. Under the new economic policy, most large industries, but not all, were controlled by the state, and they still controlled the banks. The big changes were with the smaller businesses. So under war communism, small businesses were forced to give all their profits to the state. So there was no incentive to do better, to produce more, to sell more in order to keep a profit. Under new economic policies, some small businesses were allowed to keep their profits. Agriculturally, under war communism, all that was produced had to go to the state in order to feed the military, in order to feed the poor. And the new economic policies, farmers were allowed to sell their surplus for a profit. So remember, the Civil War ends in 1920. By 1922, Lenin unites all the lands controlled by Russia into what's called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, so the USSR as it comes to be known. So it consists of Russia and these other stans and other states that you see around Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, and the like, together as the USSR. The government has an elected legislature. Citizens were given the right to vote, and workers were given control of the means of production. So again, here's a map that kind of summarizes land that was part of the Russian Empire initially, land that was part of communist territory by 1921, and then initially in 1919 that tan part that was controlled by the Bolsheviks. So this is what the USSR looks like in 1923. So you can see one of the Soviet Socialist republics is Russia, but there are many other republics as part of the USSR as well. So this is where things get a little bit different. So again, in name, the USSR was a communist state, but in practice, it didn't mirror the ideas directly of Karl Marx. So recognizing that the proletariat, the industrial worker in Russia was very small in number. They didn't have the proletariat that industrialized countries had. Lenin created a government called communist, but it was a government where the party were the ones in charge, not the people. So remember, in pure Marxism, the people would be in charge and everyone would own everything together. Well, in Lenin's version of it, the party is going to be the people in charge. Consistent with earlier autocratic Russian leaders, going all the way back to Ivan the Terrible, there was a secret police, the Cheka, as it was called. So citizens were expected to follow the party line, to follow the government policy, to not dissent, to not complain, to not work against the government. And if they did, they would be sent to a prison camp or a gulag, as they were called. And that happened quite a bit in the Soviet Union, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward. Unfortunately for Lenin, he doesn't survive long after the revolution. So Lenin dies in 1924. There's a struggle between other leaders, Trotsky and Stalin and others, for who's going to be the next leader. The ultimate successor is Joseph Stalin, and Joseph Stalin is going to be even more ruthless than Lenin was with the population, and even arguably more ruthless than previous czars, going back to Ivan the Terrible. Joseph Stalin considered one of the most ruthless dictators of all time. And we'll talk more about Stalin and his control of the Soviet Union as we go forward.